You just mentioned some elements of the Kit Kellogg's plan on Ukraine. Do you believe that freezing the front lines and deploying peacekeeping forces and this all stuff from Kit Kellogg could work with Russia and could work with Ukraine? Do you personally believe in effectiveness of this plan?
Look, the only way, and again, I really am deferential to Ukrainians. I mean, you guys are the ones fighting this war. You get to make those decisions. So, I don't have any skin in the game, and I recognize that. My tendency is to believe that if we go from we'll freeze the current lines, if that is the starting point, then you have to start from that position with, okay, if Ukraine gives up that land, obviously should never recognize those lands as Russian. That should always be recognized as occupied Ukrainian lands. But then Ukraine should have a military that, as it is today, is whatever it is, the 6th or 7th most powerful military in the world. It should stay that way. Secondarily, we should ensure that if there are no peacekeepers, American or European troops in there, that again, Ukraine has no restrictions on what it can do to defend itself. And I think those are the ways to start if you're going to freeze the current lines. And with that, you have to have a guarantee that Ukraine will eventually be in NATO. I mean, those are the only ways to guarantee that Russia doesn't reopen this war again. Otherwise, again, maybe, we'll see what ends up happening in terms of occupied Ukrainian lands. But you cannot start from a position of Ukraine gives up the land, because the idea that Ukraine has lost this war or is losing this war, and I hope your people hear this, is insane. Ukraine is winning this war. I mean, at this rate, with what Russia has taken of Ukrainian lands in the last 2 years, it would take over like 100 or 200 years for Russia to occupy Ukraine from 3 days, right? All a defending country has to do to win a war is to keep defending, and Ukraine's doing that brilliantly. So I think this negotiation should start from the position of not that Ukraine is losing and we have to negotiate, but Ukraine is actually winning this war. Now, how do we stop further bloodshed and further wars?
Retired General Ben Hodges also recently said that Russia today is in a more weak position rather than a year ago with the fall of Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. How can you assess Russia's position before the start of these negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, and how can you assess Vladimir Putin's position right now? Would he be more weaker in talks with Donald Trump, as they have lost their military presence in Syria and have sustained such unsustainable losses in Ukraine and also Kursk region of Russia? The Ukraine's offensive is going on there.
Look, if you're a believer in God like I am, you have to believe that these things that have happened in the last few months were like divinely, inspired to happen before negotiations. The loss of Syria, nobody saw coming. And then it happened really quickly. And I think that's what we're on the edge of with the Russian economy. This could be tomorrow. This could be in a year, maybe 2 years. But all indications are the Russian economy is a paper tiger. And it's sitting where the former Soviet Union was, as of today, where the former Soviet Union was just before the fall of the Berlin Wall or the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Russia can't even take back its own land. It was invaded for the first time since World War II and hasn't been able to take that back. So Russia's a terribly weak country in a terribly weak position. I mean, if you think about the number of losses that the Russian military has had, I forget the number they started out with, but they've probably lost 70% of their original invading force. At the height of Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States had only committed something like 10 or 12% of our entire military to those wars. That Putin has committed his entire military. So, look, I think Ukraine can go in this very strongly. I think Russia's in a very weak position. And I think Vladimir Putin, in his mind, is just desperately hoping that something changes when Donald Trump becomes president. But if Donald Trump becomes president and signals that he's going to stand with Ukraine, I think I think Vladimir Putin will come hat in hand begging for an end to this war.
So if Donald Trump will support and stand behind Ukraine, do you feel that Vladimir Putin will not be able to properly sleep at night?
Correct. I mean, look, here's the reality. And I think Ukrainians know this more than anybody, but Russia's not going to win this war. The only way Russia could win this war is if the West abandons Ukraine, because the Ukrainian people, as sad as it is, the burden that you guys have to bear in this fight, you're willing to bear this burden to defend your country. I mean, who wouldn't be? My God, it's your country. This is what you were born in, what you grew up in. You're just asking that you have the tools. And I got to tell you, they used to think, when I was growing up as a kid, I always thought Soviet equipment and American, NATO equipment was the same. No, it's like this. NATO equipment crushes Russian equipment. And so the more that the Ukrainian military is being outfitted with NATO equipment, which is far more than it was even at the beginning of the full-scale war, the more lethal that the Ukrainian military becomes. You will not lose this war if the West continues to stand with you. And that's the other thing is, even if the United States pulls away, the Europeans have the ability, if they decide to equip Ukraine with everything Ukraine needs to win. But Europe has to wake up. And even 3 years after the start of the full-scale invasion, it seems like they're still rubbing their eyes in the morning and haven't had their coffee yet. They're not waking up to the real threat that Russia and China ultimately is.
Also, it's interesting that according to Financial Times, Donald Trump would not like to look weak on the international stage if Ukraine loses this fight. Moreover, at the same time, he would not like to create this situation when Xi Jinping will invade Taiwan, because according to Financial Times, this could happen if Ukraine loses this fight. At the same time, Donald Trump says that he will meet with Vladimir Putin shortly after the inauguration. What is your take on such meeting, and do you believe that Vladimir Putin will agree with Trump's proposal on a ceasefire?
Look, I've met with Trump a number of times on foreign policy issues in the first Trump administration. He is nice to whoever is in the room. So I think the expectation that he's going to do something tough like Ronald Reagan would to Vladimir Putin is not the case. He'll probably sit there with Vladimir Putin and smile and tell him everything Vladimir Putin wants to hear. That doesn't mean that he's going to do everything Vladimir Putin wants him to do. But Donald Trump likes making people happy that are in the room with him. It's a really weird thing when you see it. Regardless, I think if they meet, fine. Again, nothing wrong with meeting. If the message is, look, look, Russia, we don't seek to expand a war with you, but we are not going to abandon Ukraine in this. I think that's an okay message to send. But yeah, I mean, the reality is we don't know what's going to come out of this. And I think it's important for Ukraine to basically stand and say, we're not going to give up, for the West to stand with them, for the United States to stand with them. And we'll see a successful outcome. Who knows, again, what's in Donald Trump's head. I do think what you open that question with, if you think back to when the United States left Afghanistan and how that really actually was the beginning of the end for Joe Biden, his popularity suffered. I'm still angry about Afghanistan as a veteran of Afghanistan. It made Joe Biden look really weak. If somehow, and I don't think this will happen, but if Ukraine somehow loses under Donald Trump, it will be a scar on his presidency forever. And I think that the American people do not want to see Ukraine lose. I hope you guys know that's obvious. So I do think that can be a very compelling deciding factor for him is, boy, Mr. President, you don't want to look as weak as you'll look if you abandon Ukraine. And honestly, he does recognize that in the next 4 years, there is a really serious threat of China's invasion of Taiwan. And for Ukraine to be able to defend itself sends very chilling feelings down the spine of Xi Jinping.
Also, there is a big thinking process, and there's lots of discussions that if Vladimir Putin humiliates Donald Trump, then Trump can go after Vladimir Putin, and there could be a big confrontation between Trump and Vladimir Putin. What are the chances for this?
I mean, again, I don't know. I think it's if you think back to the early Trump administration, or early in the last Trump administration, remember he was very aggressive against Kim Jong-un, and then he wasn't. This stuff can go back and forth. I personally think, again, Donald Trump is scared to death to use America's military, which, look, I get it if you don't want to use America's military against Russia. I kind of disagree with that. I actually think America's military should be used to defend Ukraine in Ukraine's territory at the request of Ukraine. But I understand it. There's a concern. But I also think, Donald Trump is volatile, and he's not volatile. He's not like explosive because he likes to keep people off guard. He just literally is that way. He's dramatic. He changes. And so, yeah, it's quite possible there could be a confrontation between the two of them. Look, I'll say this much in the broad scheme. I am much less pessimistic. So I'm more optimistic about the future of Ukraine under Donald Trump than I would have been a few months ago. That said, I obviously had my preference for who would win the presidency, but let's take what we can get right now.
That's because of Biden's cautiousness about sending military aid for Ukraine and failure to help Ukraine to actually win this war.
Yeah, look, Joe Biden gets credit for standing with Ukraine. I think genuinely wanting Ukraine to win. But there was that period of 6 months where Ukraine did not have American aid. And what was the White House doing? They were silent. They could have been shaming the Republicans in the House. They were silent. This fear, this paralyzing fear of nuclear escalation. We forget that during the entire Cold War, the Soviet Union every day threatened to use nuclear weapons. It's just what they do. They're not interested in using it. They just do it. This paralyzing fear among the Jake Sullivans and the Harvard crowd that doesn't understand how fighting really works, but has their theories. Man, that is just, I'm sure Ukraine's going to be happy to get rid of that. The only question is what replaces it. At least the good thing is we're not going to have this, academic theories about what's going to happen. Instead, we'll have at least real world opinions about what could happen in Ukraine.
Also, it seems like Jake Sullivan, a U.S. National Security Advisor, still thinks that they did the right job, right job on Ukraine. And what is your take on that?
Yeah, it's funny because what you'll see now is all these articles coming out about how great Jake Sullivan did. Well, Jake Sullivan has a lot of media contacts, and he is now trying to solidify his legacy. So he's actually finding these interviews, granting these interviews, and hope that it solidifies his legacy. Look, Jake Sullivan is a good guy. He's a good man that means very well. And again, there are areas where he does deserve a lot of credit, no doubt. But this fear of escalation, and now they're trying to defend this, what they're calling this salami approach. The slow frog boiling in the water is the only reason we didn't have a nuclear exchange. Look, Vladimir Putin knows well. He's not dumb. He hasn't been boiling in water. He knows the escalation train that's been happening, and his bluff has been called. And at every time, because he doesn't intend to use nuclear weapons. And so that certainly has been frustrating. Jake Sullivan's a good guy, but it'll be nice to get away from this fear of escalation. And hopefully the Trump administration doesn't fall into that same trap.